Can I swear?
Yes.
Save this. We're gonna get into your experience of Farscape, okay?
Okay, all right, we'll save it.
Okay.
Swearing okay though?
Oh yeah.
I don't do it very often, but sometimes it just rolls off. So
we call this thing Muppet sex and trauma. We expect
Adult conversation.
I always put the explicit tag on.
Yeah. I say fuck all the time.
Hi, friends.
Howdy, y'all.
And welcome to Muppet Sex and Trauma. I'm Sara Ezzat. I make the Fat Culture Critic videos on YouTube.
I'm Josh Gosdin, and I'm just a big old nerd.
And that's enough. And we have a second big old nerd here. We have my buddy Oddnon. Say hi, Oddnon.
I did the Princess Diana wave for some reason, but hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself to the folks?
Yeah, I'm Oddnon. I don't know if I'd call myself well, I guess I am. I'm an online content creator, self-published comic author. I write a comic book called Horserer. It's about a horse sorcerer who brews an evil beer, and anyone that drinks it becomes a thrall in his army against the T-Rexecutioner over a VHS copy of Top Gun.
Is it bad that I want to drink the evil beer?
Everybody that drinks it dies in a horrific way. It might be kind of cool. I don't know. It's as goofy as it sounds. If you like 1980s like exploitation horror, like trauma films, or like The Stuff or HoboCop or things like that, it's definitely like up that alley. In fact, The Stuff, I believe, was like the main influence for it. But we do that. We're completely self-published, 100% indie, DIY, the whole thing. And then I stream on Twitch a lot. I do a lot of voice work for a lot of videos. Chances are, if you're in that sphere of video essays, you've probably heard me once or twice. And yeah, community activist, I guess you could kind of say. I do some charity work and stuff like that too. So that's who I am. And I'm also a big old nerd.
Aren't we all? And that's enough. That's what I'd like to say. So I know this, but what's your experience of Farscape so far? How did you get into it?
It's one of those like thanks I hate it but I love it things. Especially the episode, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. But what I was saying a little earlier is I went through because I wanted to get kind of the vibe of the show. So I watched like the first 5 episodes, which did not even remotely prepare me for that episode. So I did some reading, like an hour or 2 of reading of just like what makes it exactly so horrible. And it was pretty fascinating. So I like it. I like it a lot. I'm planning on watching the full gamut of the show. So
great. So we'll definitely have you back for another episode. Maybe less gross than this one.
Oh no, maybe. I love body horror. Make it gross. Make it gross and weird.
I think I know which one I'm inviting you back for.
Yeah. There's an episode in season 2 where they pull their eyeballs out and play with them, so that's fun.
That's right up the Horserer alley, so I'm cool with that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really cool effect too, because it's all practical. So we are here to talk about Eat Me.
Eat Me.
The 6th episode, which is quite notorious. Eat Me was written by Matt Ford and directed by Ian Watson. John, Dargo, Chiana, and Jewel are away from Moya in a failing transport pod when they discover another Leviathan. This one is wearing a Peacekeeper control collar, so Dargo wants to stay away. But John insists it's worth the risk to repair the pod. When they dock, they find the ship abandoned and decaying. Well, mostly abandoned. There are some inhabitants, zombie-like cannibals lurching through the halls in packs, eating the ship, the pilot, and possibly our crew. Because this is a horror movie, our characters naturally split up. Jewel and Chiana guard the pod, while John and Dargo search for spare parts. And then they split up again, because wandering zombie-infested corridors isn't creepy enough unless you do it alone. John finds the poor, traumatized pilot and tries to get some exposition out of him, but he can barely speak. Dargo finds the man behind the zombie horde, and it's alien Hannibal Lecter. Because of course it is. John and Chiana are alerted by Dargo's screams and arrive just in time to see alien Lecter stick a spike into Dargo's brain and eat it. The zombies then go after Dargo's body, but John and Chiana drag it away. Chiana offers a prayer for her ex-lover before setting his body on fire so that the zombies will never get it. Somewhere else in the uncharted territories, Moya is answering a distress call from Talon. Aaron, Stark, and Rigel find him crippled and unconscious, as is Krace, who they take aboard. As big and bad as Talon is, something beat the yachts out of him. Back in the control-colored Leviathan, the pilot is finally up for some exposition. Alien Lecter is called Karvok. He was the only prisoner on this whole Leviathan, in isolation because the peacekeepers deemed him criminally insane. When this ship was lost from its convoy, he escaped and took control. Karvok interrupts before the pilot can explain how the former guards became the zombie horde. He knocks out John and he hits Chiana with a science bubble. The science bubble splits in two, and so does Chiana. One chi runs away in horror as Karvok brain spikes the other. John wakes to find the dead Chiana and assumes that he is now alone. But not only is there a living Chiana, if somewhat traumatized, there is also a living Dargo. Karvok explains to him that he twins people, doubles them, both equal and original. But he's doubled the zombies too many times. He's decided to spare Dargo that for now, instead choosing to, breed him with a zombie girl. And I'm starting to think this guy may not think things through. Luckily, Chiana finds and rescues Dargo before that particular plot plays out. Back in the pilot's den, John has been working to try and regain control of the ship. But when Karvok kills the pilot, John has only one last move to play. Initiate Starburst while in the control color, which will blow up the ship. He taunts Karvok into fighting, and then causes him to get his spike stuck in pilot's console. Karvok's gadgety thing explodes in science goop as John runs out of the chamber. Chiana, Dargo, and John rendezvous back at the pod to find a terrified Jewel, who has been on her own this whole time. They are preparing to leave the rapidly exploding ship when in runs another John. Later, back on Moya, the reunited crew wonder just what attacked Talon, and what they're supposed to do about having two Johns. Twins. Doubled. Both equal and original. So, thoughts? General thoughts? Oddnon, you want to go first as a guest?
One of the things that I think is not explored enough in sci-fi in general, I think that body horror often comes from the very strict definition of your body betraying you, in some way, shape, or form, or, auto cannibalism or like something like that, as to where I really liked the idea of just the sheer trauma of having to deal with the idea. The ending scene is what stuck with me the most, is where John is like throwing the rock, paper, scissors, and they keep doing rock. And what that signified to me was that line, both equal, whatever, I forgot exactly what it was. It presents a really interesting quandary that really doesn't get asked a lot, is like, if there were two of you and one of you was not supposed to be, what do you do? And that the throwing the same thing, like, and the look on his face where he's just like, like he's not able. I like that to me looked as though like you're not resigned to it, you're not giving up. It's just like you have broken to
Hmm.
where you're understanding the idea that you are equals and the same. And so to take one of you out would be to take a life is uh, kind of profound in a way.
Mm-hmm.
That really surprised me at the end.
Especially following on from Chiana's response.
Yeah, that was really good too. I guess I'm still kind of noodling on it too. Like, I number one, I don't often see trauma doesn't always happen with contemplation. And I think that most people know that, but there can be certain things to certain people that obviously just immediately trigger that response where you just cannot wrap your head around it. And especially in a sci-fi universe where you would assume, at least on the surface, that cloning, if not regular, was something that people were, I'm sorry, twinning, I believe it was referred to as,
Correct.
would be, if not common, at least understood to exist. It was a really interesting decision to make that not the case.
I'm not a big horror person, and this is my giant asterisk before my thoughts on the episode. I'm not a big horror person. Horror, because I generally don't enjoy gore. And most of my experience with horror films is lots of blood. And I've seen my fair share of zombie flicks. Also, didn't really enjoy them very much because the filmmakers did a really good job of depicting the body horror of a zombie consuming a person, or a zombie not being killed when they're dismembered or disemboweled. Um, and so all that to say, I really loved the fuck out of this episode. Like it was, to me, it was more of being locked in an asylum or being locked in a haunted house than it was a zombie flick, just straight up. And especially because we didn't actually see them eating people. We definitely saw them eating Moya, not Moya,
Roku.
Roku.
Rovu.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Rovu.
Rovu.
We definitely saw them eating Rovu in a very, carving the meat for the taco or the pita kind of a way. But we did not so much see anybody like chowing down on a person. We saw the aftermath, and it was much more affecting in a less is more kind of way. Because I think that's probably the other thing for me, is that a lot of horror stops being scary and just starts being gross. This stayed scary the whole time, and whoever they turned loose on the damn soundtrack this episode, I hope we hear more from that person, because they were doing a great job.
Oh, it's Guy Gross. It's always the same guy. He's just
Way to go. What
really
a guy.
talented.
Yeah.
And he was experimenting with some Japanese instruments on this one.
Yes.
I didn't wonder if that was the case. I don't
Yeah.
know much about music, but I definitely sensed the kind of like,
There was a pentatonic scale. There was
yeah.
a shamisen, it sounded like.
Yeah. He always makes a really unique sound universe for Farscape. And I love that he this episode, I think Ian Watson was trying different things with directing.
Yes.
Definitely, he was. I was seeing influences from Tony Tilsey's sort of usual kind of the way that he, always makes the tunnels and the corridors feel alive. But this wasn't his thing, because it was Ian Watson doing it. But there was definitely, he was borrowing bits and pieces, and the actor who played Karvok was literally someone who used to work for the Hammer Film Studios doing Hammer horror. So I like monster stuff, Like, but I tend not to be a big zombie person, or but again, because I'm not a big fan of gore. I've studied some monster theory because I love like monsters as depictions of the outsiders. So it's always interesting to me. But I would prefer like the Del Toro sort of approach of like sympathy for the monster,
Right.
or the monster is the other, or like the What We Do in the Shadows version of rather than, although it can be very interesting to see like the old 50s movies, which was very much like it's a window on how society views outsiders, and like it's just kind of fascinating. But I don't do horror. I've never watched any of the Saw films, and I never will, because I do not want those images in my head. So like, yeah, for me it's a fine balance, and I mostly I love this episode. There's one big old asterisk, and it's one we've said before.
Like I can predict.
Using sexual assault
Yep.
as a source of humor is not okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I also liked that the director seemed to be doing a lot of tracking shots, a lot of long shots. There were a lot of uncut takes that moved through a set and followed the actors around.
It was kind of interesting with the assault scene. I don't know if it was me like being into the episode, because I definitely like recognized it that way, but I do think that there is, I'm not saying it forgives it, because that asterisk stands true regardless. But I'm not saying it needed to be there, but there was the one thing I will say is I think the fact that Dargo was not, because I feel like there's usually a lot of like, especially with male characters, or perceived as male characters. I don't know enough about the Luxons to know that whole thing, but where they're like, oh no, please stop. And I will say that the one thing that I did find refreshing, because I read the same thing, the one thing I did find refreshing is that it was very clear that he was not having a good time.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is the one, I won't call it a saving grace, but is the one thing that I saw that was kind of unique about it, is you often see men in those positions that I won't say take advantage of because they're the victim, but will often resign themselves to this sort of patriarchal idea of sexuality and not being able to not consent. And so that would be like the one thing that I would say that I noticed that I found interesting about the scene, is there was no part where, despite the way that it played out, there was no part where he delayed it or kind of resigned to it. He struggled, and it was very much like I am not having a good time, That's the only comment I would have about that, but I think that's exactly right. I do recognize the way that it was played out was still meant to be kind of like, and I never appreciate that.
Yeah, and they do that. I'm glad you called that phenomenon out, Oddnon. It is definitely when the story validates an assault on a male by implying that the male should be enjoying it anyway, or by letting the character lean into it in some form or fashion, then yeah, that's pretty fucked up. So Dargo not having a good time helped it. The other thing that helped the scene was that it was Chiana specifically who was giving him a hard time. They just had their big breakup, and they're not on good terms. Those two characters are not on good terms.
Oh, see, I didn't know that. That would have changed a little bit too. But yeah,
so her specifically being the one to give him a hard time about it is a storytelling decision that helps that scene as well. But at the point that the director, I guess, told Anthony Simcoe to make it comical, then the writing and the production validates this as a comical scene. And yeah, I'm with you, Sarah. That's when it takes me out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a weird moment. It's very of its time in a lot of ways, is sort of treating male sexual assault, as especially by women, as comical. And it's complicated to me with Chiana, making it a joke, because one, not only because of their relationship, but because Chiana is the one who's had her consent violated before, and been threatened with sexual violence before.
Yeah.
Okay.
To the point where, like, it's sort of something her character normalizes.
Yep.
There was a scene, an episode you will see early in the second season, where under the influence of something, John threatens her with sexual violence, and when he apologizes, as he should when he's back in his senses, and she's like, "Oh, don't worry about it," kind of thing. And it's because to her it is such a normalized thing. So in the one sense,
yeah, makes sense that it's her character.
Yeah, and it's very dark and sad that it's normalized for her. And sometimes we comment on that as being, a problem and a trauma to her, and sometimes we don't. in the writing, and so on the one hand, her treating this as sort of a normalized thing, because this is a normalized part of her world, makes sense. But on the other hand, like, if anyone is going to have empathy, even for her ex, well, in a, but even with the complicated history of their relationship, if anyone should have empathy, it should be Chiana. And like, yet there is no, we don't treat this as a thing that needs to be empathized about.
It is an unfortunate reality in the real world, that, especially prior to being able to acknowledge one's own trauma, a survivor of sexual assault might sound like the loudest critic or egger on of somebody else in their sexual assault. They might be the least empathetic and the most cutting and biting and acetone kind of ways, because they haven't acknowledged it for themselves. They haven't dealt with it for themselves. And so they can't access that empathy for someone else. So it's very true to life as well. If we're gonna dig all the way down into this, it's very true to life as well.
It's called Muppet Sex and Trauma. Why not?
Here we go. Yeah. Which 2 out of 3 in this particular scene. Yeah. So, and it is very true to Chiana's character. Again, I was with it, with all this justification, with it in the scene, until Anthony Simcoe went like a little slapstick with it. And I was like, oh, okay, here we are.
There's this thing that happens that I wish I could remember. It was a Tumblr post like forever ago. They said the best way to gauge, or one of the best ways to gauge the writing on it, is to remove the laugh track. If you feel the same way while you're looking at it with the laugh track gone, that doesn't necessarily justify it, but it will paint a much bleaker picture of the way that it was written and why it was written that way. Now, when you get to a show like this where there is no laugh track, it does have to be played up with the, I don't want to be too graphic, but with his sort of like moans and things like this.
And the score.
Yeah, that is where the big air quotes, I don't know if we're doing the Zoom part on this, but big air quotes is like the laugh track of the scene, where they're injecting something that, while may very well be a part of that assault, that may actually be happening, when you're presenting it to an audience in such a way, there is a level of plausible deniability that you don't have, because people will interpret it a certain way. Like, if I were to rewrite that scene, not that I'm some cool guy, but if I were to rewrite that scene,
you have a self-published comic. You're pretty cool.
I'm all right. What I would have done is have what's that guy's name? The the guy with the needle,
Carvak.
Carvak, yeah.
Carvak. I would have had him, do the speech about the twinning and you need to breed with this person and have it end where it did. But then when Chiana comes in, just stops it. Like it's sort of like the prolonged view of it and her nervousness, that the nervousness is fine, but it's that prolonged, like cutting to and from the between of them that is like the sort of comedic aspect of it. If you just cut it out, I think it would have been stronger for it in that regard, There's
a couple coding aspects of this that, that occurred to me, like the things you notice when you're doing a deep dive is there is a bit of we're doing a bit of a no homo, because they have the guy who is definitely coded as a, gay coded villain, with the English accent and the fancy ways, saying we're going to breed, and they go out on that. So they're trying, there is this sort of no homo bit of a joke there, as if they're going to breed with each other.
I thought I was maybe making that up in my head, but I'm glad somebody else said that.
Yep, no, that is the cheap joke we're going for. And then the other thing is that there is, to a degree, there is a bit of black coding with Zargo. Because he is the warrior race, with the history with the Klingons. So there is that's he's clearly inspired by the fact that he's a big guy, and then the image of him like being chained and everything. There are bits and pieces there that come into the frame that I was thinking about, the way that they used to make slaves in the days of chattel slavery. They used to breed slaves, and my brain connected those bits of coding in this watch and just went, ew.
See, like, yeah. I knew that was a thing, but like I didn't see, like, that goes to show you, like I didn't even pick that up.
That is definitely me reading into the scene. It's kind of like these are bits of coding that are there, that when you put this scene together, it's like, ew, 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 ew. That's, yeah. No, this is, yeah, it's just like, yeah. So yeah, that scene is not, yeah. Yeah. That is our asterisk on enjoying the rest of this episode. That scene was choices that we should leave in the year 2000.
Yeah. There's this thing, I don't know if I can talk about like other things, but just something that made me think of is, and I'll say this right off the rip, Aladdin is probably one of my favorite Disney movies, just purely out of nostalgia and being the first time that I ever saw anyone that looked like me, well, not like me, but like looked like my family, and a lot of the community that I knew that weren't on the news being shot at. You know what I mean?
He's not playing a terrorist.
Exactly. And but there is this part of it with a thing that did often happen that was sort of trivialized in, not only is obviously the Disney version of Aladdin and the Magical Lamp not even remotely similar to the actual story, and I'll say why in a second because I don't want to take up too much time, but this sort of faking aristocracy, through this, it was through Genie, Robin Williams' Genie granted the wish. But that was a thing that happened often, and it wasn't to sort of romance these women. It was to trick, and this was common, I'm sure, among many cultures. I can only speak for my own. But it was something that happened where, like, you basically fleeced a vizier or an aristocrat out of their daughter, in exchange for either power or money, both of which Aladdin did not have. It was fake. It was bound to a spell. And to trivialize like an issue like that wasn't like directly in the story, I get that it's Disney, sort of reads like that, on top of the fact that it's like, I forgot what the actual number is, but it's like 14 different Middle Eastern cultures just kind of like crammed together like square circles and round pegs. Like none of them really match up like directly. Not that those two things are at all like directly compatible, but that's kind of what that reminds me of, is like it's clear who this movie was written by, Aladdin. It's clear the stereotypes that they truthfully probably unconsciously internalized at some point, and then that reflects in the writing that is only visible to the people
that are looking for it,
that are looking for it. They understand it.
Yeah.
You know, just as a quick side thing, the fascinating thing about 1001 Arabian Nights, is just a little trivia, is we all know the basis of the story. But what's really interesting is, if I haven't read the book directly, but I've read like a lot of passages and stuff, and there's a really unique literary tool that they use where every time, and you can cut this if you want, but every time a new story starts, it gets about halfway into the story, and then a character in that story starts telling a new story. And then the new story happens that will reference an older story and call back to like what happened to that story. And then a new character will come in and start telling a new story. So there really are not that many complete stories in 1001 Arabian Nights. It's like a bunch of half stories that all call back to each other that you have to read in order to understand like a single short story. And it's fascinating. I'm sorry. And tangent.
I love it when
we're here for tangents.
You and I will do our proper discussion of Aladdin someday as a video.
I'd love to.
The I love it, and yet
right
of it all. And also like I've always adored the story of Scheherazade, even though it is also the story of domestic violence. Like, so this is the thing. The stories you love always seem to have some dark aspect to them.
I was talking to Aronach just the other day, and Aronach said, find me a piece of unproblematic media, I dare you, or like something to that effect.
Yeah, basically.
And the thing that I started thinking about that, and I think like we, in a sense, and this is really dramatic, but in a sense, like we're all held hostage to attach memories and emotions and things to this media that we grew up with, or that we watch now, that we may have blind spots, or we were children, or misinformed, or whatever, and you draw attachments to those. And I think to like expect people with there are exceptions. There are exceptions. But to expect somebody to like immediately detach from that because it's problematic, I think is kind of a bad, it's a bad argument. I think it's much better to learn the media, understand what it's saying, understand where it comes from, and reevaluate your relationship with it. There are a lot of things my list is legion. I won't get into it now, but there are a lot of things that I enjoyed a ton when I was a kid. I had a lot attached to it. I had a lot invested in it emotionally, that just naturally understanding where it came from, how it was written, how it was done, I just kind of fell out of it, and I think that's like the more natural progression, because when it comes to media and what you enjoy, it just is reactionary. It just is, like, by the very nature of it existing. And I think trying to fight that as much as possible is important.
And there's also loving things and criticizing their faults. Like I do actually love Lawrence of Arabia. It is very messy. It is a complicated love, but I do actually love it. I grew up with it from when I was a kid. Like the sound of that score just soothes me, and there's an indelible mark on my soul of the image of Omar Sharif coming out of that sand dune, the Mirage. It's because it's one of the best entrances ever in film.
It's like the swaying back and forth and the kind of like, yeah.
That's a meet cute. And like, and I still love Buffy. You know, while I understand its faults. So like, yeah, it's, I can actually find you an unproblematic piece of media. There was an artist who literally filmed paint drying for several hours and sent it to the British Film Censorship Board as a way to fuck with them. That is how you like, yeah, no, stories are going to have problems. Culture is going to change, and the thing is that we can use that to understand ourselves and our culture and the changing relationship. I was just listening to a podcast series about the life of Michael Jackson, and like the way that people knew and didn't say, and then the way that the culture changed. And so yeah, the culture has changed around the way we talk about sexual assault, and is slowly but gradually, thankfully, changing about the way we discuss sexual assault around men. There's a couple excellent videos by a Pop Culture Detective people should check out. And
I love Pop Culture Detective.
Yeah. And so yeah, we have, I think we have probably, I don't know if anybody's got anything more to say on the big asterisks.
The only other thing that I would say, speaking of the culture changing and moving away from Oddnon, what you were talking about, of playing male sexual assault for laughs or for comedy or for some kind of patriarchal shaming opportunity in a locker room, and to where we are now, and what we can recognize now, and what we can understand now about folks' experiences, is that and I guess I want to be clear about what I've been saying about it, is just because the character Dargo seemed to be enjoying what was happening to him doesn't mean it wasn't assault.
Thank you. Yes. That is an incredibly important thing to add to it.
So for folks of all genders, at the point that an assault is taking place, a natural physical response does not invalidate the reality of what happened.
Yeah, arousal is not consent.
Right.
Only consent is consent.
And I've got the drum and the dead horse, and I've been beating them both.
Shall we talk about John's experience during this episode?
Let's talk about John, and let's talk about John. Let's talk about John, and let's talk about John.
The Johns.
Let's talk about the Johns. Oddnon, John.
John is certainly John. A little too John-like for my taste, but I could see how some Johns might like that John. No, so again, I haven't watched the whole series, but I watched again like the first 5 episodes of season 1. And this episode, because obviously it's 40 some episodes away from the first 5 that I watched. There's definitely a change in him that was not there in the first season. I do like his I always like a taunter. Somebody's like, come on, shitbag, or like whatever he says to the guy before he like sticks his thing in the console. I always love characters like that. There's something about him that reads both like I'm kind of a shitbag, but an endearing shitbag.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that tracks personally, but it seems like, especially given the intro of the show, I'm not going to go on a long tangent. Is anybody familiar with like the actual Howard the Duck in the comics?
No, but tell us about Howard the Duck.
It's very, very brief. So the 1980s movie is like so far removed from anything Howard the Duck, other than he's an anthropomorphic duck. But in the actual comics, he is it was an adult comic, number one. Not sexually, there were sexual elements to it, but it was a comic book for adults.
Mm-hmm.
So Howard the Duck is like kind of gruff, smoking cigars, womanizer. It was especially in that era. 1973, his first appearance was Adventure into Fear, number 14, with giant-sized man thing, which for some reason they did not predict was a joke.
I'm sorry, giant-sized man thing.
That was the they used to do these giant-sized issues, is what they were, and they had Tales of Suspense, Adventure into Fear. Like they had like these themed books, and so the big issue would be called like Giant-Sized Adventures into Fear or whatever. Well, this one in particular was the debut of Man Thing, and so it's Giant-Sized Man Thing 4 and 5 in 1925.
I am 12.
No, it is just objectively funny.
You're with the rest of America, yeah.
But so the big theme with Howard the Duck, though, is he is trapped on Earth, and he constantly refers to himself as a man trapped in time that wasn't made for him, and he was never meant to be a part of. And I very much read John the same way. Is a lot of his earthly ways. Well, we of Earth read his behavior as shitty and unkind in a lot of ways, and also endearing in others, from what I've seen. Probably doesn't translate the same, to some otherworldly universe or whatever the case may be. So as soon as I saw John, the first thing in my brain, I was like, this is a Howard the Duck tale. Like, this is exactly what this is almost,
And he would probably read that.
Probably.
John's a big nerd. Well, yeah. To bring it full circle, James Gunn specifically cited Farscape as an inspiration for Guardians of the Galaxy.
Oh, that makes so much sense, and why Guardians is not the best. Not that Farscape is bad, like, and the Guardians films of like the Marvel films are probably my favorite, just because they do like more, and it's not just like the world ending every time.
Sure.
So those are probably my favorite, like, of the Marvel atmosphere, but that's really not saying a lot.
I mean, I really enjoy the Guardians of the Galaxy films apart from Chris Pratt. And even in the third film, I can even tolerate him. Jesse and Aronok did a wonderful breakdown of those films that made me like them even more.
Oh, I should check that out.
Yeah, it's a long one, but it's worth the time.
You mentioned two names that are just worth the time. If the names are on the tin, like, I'll probably watch it. So
especially when they're working together.
Yeah.
But yeah, he is Dorothy Gale with no fucks to give.
Yeah. Very fish out of water. I'm getting to a point where John's frustration with nobody listening to him is starting to frustrate me.
Say more.
So we've talked about this in a couple of these episodes this season so far, but John is mostly with this season grappling with the consequences of his bad decisions, the consequences of his mistakes, of his impulsive decisions specifically, and is dealing with a lot of self-recrimination as a result. But he is stuck in trying to fix it by trying to do the same thing but better. By trying to but listen, if you listen to me this time it'll go right, it'll go well. Or if you follow me this time, it'll go right or go well. And so that was never more prominent in this episode than it took them all of the first 45 seconds of Act 1 for them all to get split up in this house of horrors, and John to be like, I tried to keep them together when, after he thought Dargo was dead. He's like, I tried to keep us together, but we just wouldn't listen to each other. Like that tiny little kernel of dialogue was the closest he's come to a breakthrough. And I was like, and then it just, the story moved us along, which I understand we're in a long form archy kind of a situation. But I was like, God damn it, John, you were so close. You were so close to having introspection and taking a good hard look at yourself. And now he
Oh.
literally can, as of the end of this episode, which I'm very intrigued about, because I feel like he has been doing nothing but second guessing himself all season.
Wait, so are so you're new to this series too? You're up to this episode. You haven't went
I
past
am,
it
yeah.
yet.
I haven't seen anything
yeah.
past this episode.
I think Sara mentioned that, and I didn't like think about it until now because my brain is rotting from the inside out. But
this is my first experience with the show overall.
Very cool.
Yeah. And so I definitely have a much more raw reaction to a lot of the things in here. Sara has done a really good job of kind of shepherding, me through this whole thing. And she's also got her beloved characters and her beloved arcs and stuff like that. I've shat on a couple of them on accident over the course of our time together, but John mostly I've been a big fan of. He is usually very relatable, and it's probably the problem in this episode is it is a little too relatable.
I like in this episode, I feel like we begin with John being mirrored and we end with a literal mirror, because
Yes.
he and Dargo's problems are, they're acting too alike. They're both trying to lead. It's like Chinese finger trap. They're mirroring each other and they are miscommunicating because of it, and they're bouncing off of each other, and they're both trying to be alpha. And John loses, because they have a very brother relationship, and he, they have that conflict, and then he literally watches his brother die, his figurative brother die, and like then we get that moment of reckoning with that. Like he's reckoning with the way that like he is doing the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results.
Yeah.
And we've gone from him like dealing with mirroring a mirror in his brother, and the way that they are antagonizing the fuck out of each other because they're not communicating. And I think Dargo is in the exact same place of he's been doing the same thing but trying to do it better, because this is exactly where his relationship with Chiana went wrong, is like trying to be high-handed and lead everything and be the top dog. and it's not working. And so we've got that, and then we end the episode with John has a new mirror.
Yeah. And what better way to avoid second guessing yourself than literally getting to make two different choices? So I'm really interested to see where this goes.
I think that's I think I said it maybe a little earlier, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but one of the things that really like got me was like, not only is it a literal mirror, as in, well, I guess it technically is figurative, but his twin is in front of him and they're doing the same thing. No differences, perfectly equal. And it just occurred to me, based on what you just said, is that's kind of a fascinating comparison, because when they're throwing the rock, paper, scissors, John, from what I'm understanding from what you've said, what little I've seen, is starting to come to the idea that he can't make a different decision. Like he has painted himself in this corner where he now has to confront the idea that there is a literal clone of him in front of him that has the inability to think differently. It sort of like projects your own concept of choice and freedom like back at yourself. The fact that they're both throwing rock, and there's the fucking like gun on the table. Like this is a dire decision. And even in that situation, he's unable to decouple himself from his own like thought process, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, in that he can't just do better. You can't just change. You have to actually do the work to change.
Yes. You have to take a good, hard look at yourself.
Yeah, and wherever you go, there you are.
Oh, but I say that so many times. Do you know how many times I've sat and like played rock, paper, scissors with myself? Like in that way, where like I make a really bad mistake, let's say. And you try to fix it by doing the same mistake better.
Yep.
By like saying like let's say I upset somebody, just I said something, whatever. And you keep trying to approach the person and saying like, I'm so sorry. That wasn't my intention. And they're like kind of putting you off because that's not really an apology. You're not owning anything. And so you're like, well, if I just say it harder, maybe they're going to get it. You know what? I am so sorry. I just want you to know I understand that you're upset, but I just need you to know that that wasn't my intention. And they put you off again. And that is John, like, it's just like this sort of like self-masturbatory justification cycle in your head that it's a selfish like thing. Like you aren't understanding that they don't accept it. You're thinking you only. You're thinking I'm not saying it right. I'm not being heard. And that's the difference between, not apologizing and apologizing, is you have to externalize your own thoughts to empathize with somebody else. Because, like you said, the definition of insanity and stuff is like, there's only so many times you can do the same thing, but people just keep doing it. It's comfortable. It's like a warm blanket to say like, because you will have evidence in your head of like, oh, I've done this a million times. And people said, oh, it's okay. Without having the understanding that like, maybe it wasn't okay. Maybe those people are still not okay with this. And that's why they don't call me anymore. Or maybe they said it was fine just to make me stop trying to talk to them. Like there's a lot more that needs to happen than what goes on in here. So that's why that really stuck out to me.
And a real apology is changed behavior.
Yeah. Words are words. Action is action.
So yeah, like it's a really interesting moment for John, and there's going to be interesting things ahead.
I mean, we're like, we've made a very substantive change to this show just now. And you've been saying this from the beginning. So our Farscape is about consequences. Like everything has an impact.
That's what makes it special.
Yeah, for sure. And characters from the first season come back in the second season finale or whichever one it was, the heist. And a lot like things matter in this show. And so the fact that we end the episode with two Johns staring at each other means that we're going to have a couple of Johns for a while. And what is that going to mean? What's that going to do? And it's, the very on the nose final shot freeze frame of them finally choosing scissors, which is 2. Just was the cherry. It was the cherry on top.
I didn't even catch that. I watched that episode twice. I was playing. Nobody in the comments yell at me. I was playing World of Warcraft while I was watching. I'm not a big World of Warcraft guy, but I have a friend playing it. But I was playing that while I watched it the second time. I watched the first time like in whole. And just before we got on at like 6:00, I was like, I'm gonna watch it one more time. But I didn't catch it the first time. Then the second time, obviously, I was distracted. But that's really interesting.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about the ending on scissors means ending on 2. This is why we pay you the no money.
Right. I'm earning my salary today.
I say we increase your salary to more no money.
Let's double it.
I will give you 2 times more no money.
Perfect.
Well, if we ever get enough patrons to cover more than the cost of running.
We're moving on up, moving on up.
I should have brought you on sooner, Oddnon. You're all right.
Spotify. Yes. Oh, so fun.
Yeah,
So we talked.
Tonti John is good, and also traumatized, desperate country accent John makes another return.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely like turning into his like trauma accent. Like when he's in a really dire situation, he gets real Southern fried real quick.
Yeah, see, I thought that was just like a lapse in the acting. Like when the guy goes to the pilot's room in the Leviathan,
Mhm.
and I was like, why is he like?
No, it's
Put
a
a, like,
consistent
no.
phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ben doesn't seem to do things by accident. He makes a lot of choices. There's a lot of stuff that are Ben choices that get added in, and I think the times that he goes, I'm gonna pull the Southern,
It's when
are
he's
intentional choices.
most up against the wall, usually.
Yeah, and when
That's
he's going
cool.
a bit manic, because the other mirror in this episode is like, a lot of shows would bring in something like the criminally insane and like really sanist. But this is a show where most of the characters are criminals and all of the characters have mental illness problems.
There was just a little,
I mean, our people all have journeys of empathy and stuff, so they are not the eat your family kind of mental health problems.
Well, except for the Zarai, apparently.
Yeah, like only Karvok is the eat your family kind of Hannibal Lecter.
I'm trying to think of like an alternative phrase for like criminally insane. And I'm sure there is one, but I don't know it.
It is very much more of a fictional concept than certainly than a diagnosis. Because like it depends what you define as criminal and what you define as insane. And these are very much like, to get very lefty and pull out Mr. Foucault. These are very
Is this
much
a prison?
We're in a prison ship again, because we're always in a prison in a prison ship. So like and we have and we our prison guards are once again the fascist cops, and I repeat myself. So like there's always a sense of like, these are constructed categories: criminal and insane. Like, actually, criminally insane used to sometimes be a metaphor for just gay. Because it was it was both criminalized and considered insane. So like, but this like this constructed character of like the monster, the idea of like Hannibal Lecter, which is based on Ed Gein, who was a serial killer who was not charming and erudite. He was a deeply dysfunctional guy who could not communicate, and so played with body parts, which is also what Jeffrey Dahmer was. And it's a weird thing that our fiction likes to glamorize these into like these sort of mastermindy kind of other category of monster creations. It gets away from the fact that they are dysfunctional humans, and like with usually very tragic histories as to how these things happen, which is, but instead we make them instead we'd rather have this sort of like weirdly romantic figure of the serial killer. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but it was thoughts on the whole like criminally insane thing, when again, like, all of our characters are criminals with mental illness. And if they don't have mental illness, they have trauma, major PTSD stuff. So
I have a bit on that, actually, from like very recently, like around the time of Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm so sorry. I'm not apologizing because I feel bad, but like I don't know what the constraints of the podcast are. So like I'm just kind of riffing off everybody. Feel free to cut anything. I won't be upset. But
We
for
do this to
Halloween,
each other.
my various like neurodivergent, I was talking to Sara about this earlier, but like I just had this thing where I just think that it's rejection sensitivity, like textbook, but I just assume that I'm
No, Habibi,
bothersome in some way.
you are welcome here, and we want your insights. Please
And I
give us your
appreciate it.
insights.
Thank you. For Halloween, I really do thank you for that. For Halloween, I'm not a true crime person. I enjoy. I draw a line with myself. There are people that are like true crime. Yes, give me the bodies, give me the body parts. Tell me and like that's not me. I don't talk about it. I like to know like history of things. I like more objective views than like sensationalized views. I did not watch the Dahmer show even before we knew. No shade on anybody that did, but even before the whole thing about not talking to the families came out, I've just never found it valuable to watch like a recreation, you know. One of the, and I want to be very clear when I say this, okay? In no uncertain terms do I forgive, condone, otherwise cape for the actions of anybody that's committed any atrocities. But there's one that I find deeply interesting, and it is Ed Kemper. Very famous. I won't go into his whole thing. It would take too much time. But in terms of his incarceration, I am, prison abolitionist. I'm anti-police. That is a very complicated subject with things like this that I'm still learning about, so I'm not going to get into it. But in his prison tenure, as far as I'm to understand, he consistently refuses his release hearings. And he's become like this model prisoner. He's set up like mental health wellness programs for the prison that he works at. I don't know how tenuous or difficult that is, or how they get funded, or if they do it all. But just became like this model prisoner. And I decided for Halloween, I was like, I'm gonna watch the full interview of Ed Kemper. It's like 2 hours long. And they ask him basically everything. He details his crimes. And the interviewer consistently keeps asking, well, are you, and I'm going to use this word here, and I apologize. Feel free to bleep it, but I'm going to use the C word for that's sanest. But the interviewer continuously says, well, did you think you were crazy? Did you think you were out of your mind? Were you out of control of your actions? And it's the only time I've ever heard somebody that's done those things that says, no, I was in control the whole time. There's nothing about the mental illnesses that I have that contributed to my actions. I was angry. I was upset. And that is the way that I rationed out to get out of it. And I knew the consequences and I did it anyway. And here I am. And it was just really fascinating to hear somebody, especially when you hear about these serial killers being, oh, they were out of their mind, or they were schizophrenia, or like whatever they blame it on, whatever era it was. It was really fascinating to hear somebody who did do many terrible, unforgivable things, just atrocities, that says like, no, like I did it. I wanted to do it. That's how I thought it should be done. And there's nothing about me that would preclude me from doing that. And they like went on to say, this Ed Kemper person went on to say like, didn't say this directly, but basically insinuated that the blame on mental illness is misplaced because anybody is capable. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with support structures and whether or not you have these systems in place that can help you. And he didn't have those. And then he goes on to talk about, which I disagree with, but who am I to disagree with somebody that exists in that atmosphere? and said, this is the most structured environment I've had. I recognize that there are problems with it, but this is what I needed my whole life. I needed to have structure, security, these kinds of things. And for in that context, he seems to have thrived. I mean, I don't know. It's just a fascinating, with the criminally insane thing we were talking about, really fascinated me, and kind of chilled me to the bone, to be honest, for Halloween of all things. Is I was like, wow, I didn't expect to be scared in a way that was not of the dude that did the things.
Deeply psychologically scared. Yeah,
exactly. So that's my bit on that.
It's fascinating to me to talk about, or to listen to you talk about, such a grounded humanistic perspective on crime and on the harm that gets criminalized, when in this episode, this Hannibal Lecter mastermind, whose name, by the way, I think, in my opinion, is a riff on Kevorkian, because he's definitely got that kind of surgical doctor. He's dressed on a smock.
And with
exactly, yeah.
Yep.
And basically, what he's doing is he's killing people for his own, for his own philosophy. But
was that did Kevorkian was that his thing? Did he do it
his thing,
or was it?
No, his thing was assisted suicide, as I recall.
Oh, but it wasn't like sadistic. It wasn't like a thrill thing, or I don't know what
no.
Yeah, I thought he was like an actual doctor that got like
he
criminalized for his position. Okay,
yeah,
he definitely was. But this is definitely a consistent depiction of a Kevorkian-like character for the era. The kind of monstrous over exaggeration of him, but the character is barely a character. We don't know what his crimes were. We don't know where the hell he got the duplicating goop. We don't know why half of his skull is exposed and he is ingesting other people's brain matter through his brain. We don't know what the hell that needle thing is. And we have no idea how he managed to overpower an entire Leviathan full of peacekeepers and take over run the asylum. Was very much the vibes from the horror genre that this episode was getting. He's much more of a force of nature than he is a character. He's much more nebulous.
I noticed they don't talk about how he got like the thing.
Yeah.
They don't talk about any of the head stuff. They don't talk about why he like does in his own head like that. They don't talk about any of that. And like, I don't wonder if that like does it better.
It's the nothing is scarier phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's Jason from the first movie. It's Michael Myers from the first movie before we learn a lot about them. But it's very much Ed Kemper on the one hand is the comparison that you brought up, and very in-depth understanding, humanistic perspective on crime and punishment, no literary allusion intended. And then on the other hand, we have Carvach, who just comes and goes in this episode and leaves us with one of the biggest so far consequences that we've seen in this show. Like, we don't know anything about this guy.
I think about it
horrifying.
Yeah, I think about it in terms of the character, where like that is just how it is sometimes. Is like you encounter somebody, a lot of people might say like, oh, it's uninformed, we want to know more. Just from what I watched with my two watches, is like there's something about the mystery of it.
Yep.
That like I've ran into so many situations in my life where I'm like, what the fuck is happening right now? And it affects me so deeply, and you just don't get that closure in life.
Never get to know.
Yeah, that's something that exists in storybooks 9 times out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he is very much a less is more.
Yes.
And I think because he is this sort of force of nature, he's kind of like, and because at this point in the series, sort of mental health problems and trauma as itself a character, because it is so much it has been such a huge thing. You will see this as you catch up to this point. But like,
it's Muppet Sex and Trauma on purpose.
Particularly John's loss of sanity. I mean, sanity is a construct anyway, but what is sane? But his like struggles to hold on to his own mind that have caused so much damage. And now we have someone, and John has all these feelings about that. And now we have this person who has no feelings about being just an unhinged destructive force. And just sort of like the human embodiment of trauma, of violence, of lack of empathy, of whatever. It is again kind of in a episode about reflections. He is again a reflection, and it's interesting because like the thing about like this idea of insanity and is we have this thing, humans, creatures that we are, where we sort of divorce horrific actions from the context that makes them logical. Because people have been talking about how like bigotry is just insanity or whatever, and genocide is these must be insane. It's like
absolutely
we divorce these horrific actions or these things we don't from the context which makes them logical, which is usually some combination of power and fear. Because we're doing the neoliberal look at everything in a vacuum, everything is individuals, we're going to ignore all the systems, so we divorce it from all of that makes it make sense, and then we say this doesn't make sense, ergo it must be the product of a of
an anomaly.
It must be the product of a broken brain. It must be resulted from a lack of logic, a lack of thing, and therefore it is not me. I know it's not me because I know I'm safe. Like like Gianna's being like, I know I'm me. Like no, and of course some of us maybe don't get the medications to prove it. But like no, I me, the regular Joe public. No, me. I know my brain is not broken. I would not act that way. That is insanity. And we forget that there are actual people with diagnoses of mental illnesses. Hello, I'm one. And or even or more stigmatized mental illnesses than autism and depression. Who are then like it's like the experience that you and I have talked about of like being fat and having people be like mocking Donald Trump or the like for being fat, and it's like, really, of all the things you're gonna make fun of, and you're gonna pick on that, and like you're comparing us to that. This is fun. People, so like I hear people with more stigmatized mental illnesses than I have like I hear the feelings that they have about like their existence being this thing that people use to mock or to abjure this, to be like, that's just craziness.
I have a group that I mod, and I had to kick somebody out for who had warnings, and I kicked them out for calling people crazy. And specifically in the context of like everything happening right now. I don't want to go into that, but that's the framework. And they were like, oh, well, so you're gonna you don't want their feelings to get hurt. You don't want their feelings to be hurt because I said they were crazy. And you're like, that's not it. You will hurt their feelings, but by proxy, you will hurt the feelings of every other person you're in community with, because they know that if they're on the wrong side of the barrel of that gun, they're going to get the same thing. They know that if they have a bad take or they say something that might be not great because they don't know, they know now that they will not be afforded grace. It's not about preserving the feelings of bad people. It's about preserving the feelings of the people in proximity to those people. And if you start calling people fat or ugly or this, that, which I am incredibly guilty of many times over, that's been a recent change where I've learned a lot and changed, tried to change.
The Maya Angelou principle. You do your best till you know better, then you do better.
Exactly. And that's like that thing is like, I did the same thing in 2016. I talked about Trump the same way. I was a neolib. I was a little farther than neolib, but I was still pretty well there. And I very quickly came away from that, but I had a lot of people that would say why would you say that? And I'm like, whoa, Donald Trump's he's dipshit. Fuck that guy. And they're like, yeah, but all of his ideas are really bad. The shit that he does is really bad. Why are we?
Could we focus on the actions he chose to do?
Well, it really just is a smokescreen, right? When you make fun of somebody's weight because they're a bad person, it doesn't. All it does is rally people around to do the same thing. It doesn't attack the idea. It doesn't attack the person in the way that they think it does. All it does is get a bunch of people that think fatness is bad or mental illness is bad or any of these categories is bad and gets them to say the same thing because they all hate the same guy. The people that do that are not criticizing the ideas. They might sometimes, they might have a post about whatever, or say something, but that presentation is important. The way that you lambast somebody for ideas is incredibly important.
Yeah, because if you use the stigmatized thing as an insult, you are reinforcing the stigma.
Well, and you're handing a bullet to the allies of the people that you're insulting to be able to validate your own arguments. And you're hurting yourself and kicking your own ass in a couple of different ways. I'm gonna tangent and try to bring it back myself here in just a second.
Sorry.
No, you're but sorry, you better edit out all the sorries. Your perspective and thoughts on this episode have been phenomenal, and I'm glad you're here. And this is the first time that you and I have really interacted, and I think met. So there's a concept that is prevalent in equity and inclusion training or diversity training that folks can go through in any number of settings. I've gone through it in the higher education setting. Folks can go through it in a corporate setting and that kind of a thing. And it is the notion that one of the ways that specifically systemic racism, but in general systemic prejudice survives is by attaching it to morality. And by saying that racism is an inherently evil or immoral thing, which then puts anybody who's white or white passing and receiving feedback on how they're interacting with the world immediately on the defensive. Because they're like, but I'm not a bad person. And I'm like, I'm not saying that you're a bad person. I'm saying that you have deeply ingrained cultural smoke screens that have been placed upon you that you need to work to move past, and you have the capability of doing so. I'm like, well, but it's so mean to call someone racist. Fuck you. And I'm not racist. I have at least a black friend. And then it's the same kind of a concept of using those kinds of value judgments as an attack inherently devalues the perspective that someone is trying to advance necessarily. But then on the flip side as well, maintaining those value judgments, as a shield to hold up, is what keeps people on the wrong side of something, on the unhealthy side of something, and in some cases, on the bad side of something. And it's a fun trope to use. It's a fun character to sketch from in these kinds of genre settings, of the mad scientist running the asylum, of the inmates running the asylum. And it definitely, I think you're right, Sara. It definitely works very well because it's less is more, because we when we're reviewing a story, don't necessarily need, the backstory of Carvok's childhood, and the first time that he tasted flesh, and now he is where he is, and all that kind of stuff. He's a hurricane in this episode. It works very well.
And I think he's less othered as the in quote unquote insane person, because there are no sane people in our story. If sane is like, if there is such a thing as sane, which I'm not convinced there is. But he's also like, all of our people actually do care about others, except for possibly the sane character of Scorpius, who isn't present in the story.
Yeah. Sir not appearing in this story.
Yes. Most logical and consistent acting person is the one who, with no empathy or scruples whatsoever. And that's our villain, who, yes, you haven't met yet, Oddnon, but he's not in this particular episode because there's just no room for him with Carvok there. There would be no scenery left to eat. Especially as John is doing it. Ben is doing a big job of scenery eating himself.
God, they all are. The number of times that somebody ran through a hallway and shouted someone else's name in this episode.
It's pretty light on plot, but really heavy on atmosphere and yelling.
I mean, it's such a basic plot too. It's you're locked in the closet with a madman. What are we going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. That's the plot.
and zombies.
Yes.
Yeah. And the zombies are kind of interesting, just doing a weird monster logic thing, in that the zombies are former peacekeepers.
Go off.
Which the peacekeepers are already kind of zombies, because they're treated as like, okay, so the history of zombies as a story. This is actually but I studied monster theory at university.
You almost had me as I was drinking a sip of water.
So the creation of the zombie myth actually harkens back to the time of slavery, to Haiti, and specifically Haiti, and I think it was also present in some of the other sugar islands. And the original thing is, it was, as I have been told, like, there are some inspirations from African folklore, but the story which developed out of chattel slavery was that if you killed yourself, you would spend your afterlife like as a reanimated corpse, working, mindlessly working forever. And there were always the zombies and the sorcerer who created and ran the zombies. So it is actually a sort of a slave's view of slavery. If we read the way that they created the zombie myth, like, it is the fate worse than death. It gives you sort of a window on the perception of what it was like. And this is probably one of the worst places on earth, was working in the sugar plantations and sugar processing, because it was just like incredibly hot work in an incredibly hot climate, and they just like, it was just putting people into a meat grinder.
Mm-hmm.
And so out of that came the story of this being a mindless drone that was run by somebody else in control of your body, And yeah, it's, I mean, the way that we tend to read it, modern zombie movies tend to, like, the myth has changed a lot, and there tends to be a lot of capitalism inspiration, and the idea of like the internal consumers, the internal consumption is part of the zombie movie myth nowadays. It's partly acquired the story of I think it's the Wendigo, or there's an indigenous story about a creature that is just an undead creature that constantly consumes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean,
A very pale creature that constantly consumes. I wonder where that was inspired by.
Dawn of the Dead taking place in a shopping mall.
Yeah.
Doesn't get much more on the nose than that.
Yeah, it's like the history of zombie stories is fascinating, but it's really interesting to me that we have the peacekeepers have been zombified. The fascist cops, the fascists, with no one left to oppress, are consuming themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting nightmare vision of, I don't know that there's any there, but there was a thing. The way that capitalism and fascism dehumanize the perpetrator as they dehumanize the oppressed. Like, it has this feedback loop. There is a reason why cops are prone to domestic violence and prone to suicide. It's because oppressing people destroys the oppressor. When the foot soldiers of the oppressors, really, because they're caught in that position of, because yes, dehumanizing others dehumanizes yourself. Am I making too much out of a bunch of
No, I don't think you are.
A bunch of zombies consuming Rovu. Anyway, well, I think we need to talk about Jules' experience of this episode as well, because it is the first time we get real vulnerability from Jewel, I feel.
I like the smacking Jewel over the head, and I forget what the line is. It's like, violence, you'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's the violence device. Go figure it out.
And yet she missed her own face when she tried to shoot herself.
I couldn't decide if that was because Chiana like barged in and it like scared her, so she like, moved. Or if it was just complete incompetence, the recoil of a laser rifle.
I'm gonna go with both.
Yeah, maybe it's a baker's dozen of reasons, like a little bit of A, a little bit of B, sugar and spice,
My parents always told me I could do anything I put my mind to. Just had me laughing, rolling on the floor while she was. I can do this. I can venture out into a haunted house and rescue everybody, and with a gun I've never used before. And then just the smash cut to her running back into the transport pod. It was like a cartoon.
Tabby McIntosh is the actor's name. She usually does soap opera stuff, and she's really very good in this. Mm-hmm. The physical comedy to sort of balance out the horror of everybody else, and also, like, this, I feel, is the first time we get real vulnerability from Jewel. Because like falling in mud and drinking piss in the last episode didn't really give us vulnerability, but I should have believed my parents when they told me I could do anything. That's vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And also, how did she so royally fuck up the transport pod?
She sheds.
I missed that.
Yeah, at the beginning they're pulling out her hair.
Oh, yeah, I missed that.
And also, like, she's a toddler with a baseball bat. She's just like
Sure.
spoiled little princess who does not belong in this space whatsoever. But I think, I think it works. She's a mess, but I like her.
Yeah, no, she was a lot of fun in this episode. She was the appropriate comic relief balance that we needed, not the Dargo scene.
Yeah.
Having an inexperienced character with like an entire concept that exists in other cultures, or however it plays out, I think is far funnier and far more interesting even than the Dargo part.
Yeah, and then we had Chiana, just, oh, poor Chiana, just this whole time. I felt like I was feeling like they were damseling her, but then she rescues herself.
Yeah,
Which, yeah.
She was very much the final girl in this episode. If we're going to follow the horror framework is properly in place at this point, she was the final girl, and subverted because she wasn't actually the final girl. She just thought she was.
Yeah, John was the final girl.
Yeah, well, none of them were because everybody survived. But in her own story, she was playing the final girl in turning around and preparing to fight, Michael Myers or Jason or whomever. And that was, in my opinion, really a really fun play with her usual role in the episodes of either being the troublemaker or the one who needs rescuing.
And we also got a mirror moment from her because Chiana has always been the one who runs away if she can't crawl her way out of things.
Mm-hmm.
And running away from herself.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, and considering the way that things went with Dargo, we got running away from herself.
The symbols couldn't symbolize any harder.
I need to smash in the guy going, the meme of the guy going, some writers use subtlety. I think they're cowards.
Yeah, when she's literally confronted with, not just confronted with herself, but confronted with the possibility of helping herself, of saving herself, she runs in the other direction. Yeah, the metaphors are metaphoring as metaphors they possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Which, on that note, there's a question, I think, about John when he's running away, when he's running to the transport, and the look on his face when he sees the other John.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's the first time he saw the other John? Or do you think he thought if they could escape, he wouldn't have to deal with the other John?
Ooh, I like that question.
I've never had an answer for that question, but it's always, I felt, been a question about this episode.
I like that question.
Did he see that? Because Dargo experienced the twinning.
Mm-hmm.
Even for like brief period of time. Yeah.
There's a really fun film called The Prestige that deals with this concept as well, and definitely puts the question of who am I and how do I know who I am front and center. And Dargo,
who directed that?
Christopher Nolan.
Yep. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, it was an in between Batman. Yep. And Dargo definitely brushed up against that question for this episode as well, of like, who am I and how do I know who I am?
And Dargo is interested in the question, and Chiana is running from it.
Well, sure.
I think what's left to discuss is
the other half.
The other piece, quarter of this episode, the through line for the next episode. And for the season plot stuff where Aaron and Rigel and Stark find Talon and Crais.
I first of all love the crack putting together of those three characters, because all three of them bounce off of each other quite well.
Mm-hmm.
Like Aaron is super straight laced and lawful good, and Stark is super chaotic in the chaotic good, where he's going to try to help folks out, but also you never know exactly what he's going to do next. And Rigel is somewhere in between true neutral and chaotic neutral.
Yeah. Rigel is Rigel.
Rigel is Rigel. Eggs are eggs.
Yeah. And being Rigel, he of course wants to get the fuck out of there and not help anybody.
He's being super pragmatic about it. He's like, we're like, if Talon got his ass kicked, we don't stand a chance. Like, that's a valid argument to make for sure. And it definitely is a much more valid argument than his usual, like, frail that, let's go, and to me is points to a really fun evolution of his character has undergone, of being less selfish and much more selfless, but in a very like pragmatic way.
For a given value of Rigel.
Is pragmatically selfless a thing?
It is when you're Rigel, it's for a given value of Rigel. As always. And of course Aaron wants to help. But yes, it is interesting that you're always excited when we see Crais, and now an unconscious Crais who's beat the fuck. Do you have any thoughts?
I have nothing but questions, and I'm excited to see what happens next.
And you like, I'm sure Oddnon, you don't really know what to make of it, since the last time you saw Crais, he was chasing. He was on the opposite side chasing them. So yeah,
right.
Things have occurred.
Characters have charactered.
I'll be watching through, I think. I'm actually gonna rewatch the first 5 episodes and then just like keep going, I think is gonna be my next endeavor.
You can skip Jeremiah Crichton.
Do not skip Jeremiah Crichton.
Well, I just,
before we get to favorite parts, the next episode, Josh, is called Thanks for Sharing.
Cool.
Pretty harrowing.
You want to make any predictions?
It's about to get real kinky up in here. Is it still a threesome if one of you is a duplicated twin?
I don't know. Ask Anya. Yeah. So we shall. Yeah. Okay. That's our prediction. I'll take it.
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be in 2 weeks. Find us a guest for that. Yet, but I will. So, Oddnon, you want to go first? What is your favorite part of this episode?
It was the end. Like, by and large, that was the part that I think not just affected me, but I thought was like both interesting, like in terms of storytelling and the visual representation. I think that was probably my favorite part.
Mm-hmm. Same, actually. I really like the just dead eyes in both of the Johns as they were rock, paper, scissoring, or they were odds and evensing. I actually couldn't tell which one they were doing. But then also the other, I guess, favorite part of this episode, like I mentioned at the very beginning, was the score. The score was outstanding.
Yes. The score, the production.
Oh God.
It took them 2 weeks apparently to take down to set the quarters back to normal. This team just loves doing weird shit.
Oh yeah, and it pays off for them too.
Yeah. My favorite part, I think I'm gonna go with that smash cut on Tammy McIntosh on the
teetering back into the ship.
Just the way that it just the door opens and you get the shot just holding on her face, and then smash cut. Like, it's just it's not grand or thematic or anything, but it just is so well done, and such a good like counterbalance to all of the everything.
Yeah.
Oh, the thing to note at this point, Now, apart from Tammy McIntosh, apart from Joel and Rigel, every main character has died in some form or fashion.
Good for them.
They call this the season of death, and in some way or another, all of the main characters have died, and we've had a couple of the Rigel fake out deaths too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's the thing you can do in sci-fi. So I think that's it for us for this episode. Oddnon, would you like to tell us how the folks can find you?
I actually have like two things, as weird as that may be.
Oh, of course.
So I don't know how much anyone in present company reads comic books, or anybody that watches the show reads comic books. But if you're into Farscape, I cannot suggest enough. There's a comic by Brian K. Vaughan. He is one of my favorite writers. Him and Peter David are two of my biggest influences in writing, just period. Yeah. And Brian K. Vaughan writes a comic called Saga. It is very, very similar to Farscape. I don't know if this is true, but I feel like it's been mentioned that Farscape was an inspiration, in part. But it is about very briefly, it's about two factions that are fighting. One faction has horns, one faction has wings, and there is a faction of people with TVs for heads that are like the elite, and using these two people, the horned people and the winged people, for a proxy war over resources on different planets. And one of the winged people is subjugating one of the horned people as a slave, and they end up falling in love. The way they handle it is very beautiful, and they fall in love because they like the same romance novel. And it humanizes like both characters, and they decide that they're going to make a break for it because the winged person gets pregnant and their child has both wings and horns. And the TV head people that are subjugating both races recognize that if the news of this child gets around, that it could break ranks in all of their propaganda. And they send out a series of assassins to try to kill both characters as well as the child. One of the assassins is named the Will, and I'm not going to get too much into this, but goes to this like the planet is called Sextillion. It's like kind of this like silly part of it, but there is a young girl that is there that the Will kills the woman that owns her and takes her to a faraway planet. The Will's companion is this blue cat, which looks like an Egyptian Sphinx cat. And its name is Lying Cat. And it can speak, but it can only say lying. Because it can sense when people are lying. And there's this really beautiful panel, and I'll just share it. The girl's name is Sophie, and it's her with Lying Cat, and it's just 4 panels. And she's like kind of talking to herself because she's like 6.5 years old, I think. And she says, "My name is Sophie. I'm 6.5 years old. I can stand on one leg for a real long time. My favorite color is blue-green," which is the same color as Lying Cat. "I want to be a doctor or a dancer when I grow up." And then the panel shifts and she looks really sad. And she says, "I'm all dirty on the inside because I did bad things with." And then Lying Cat, who's sleeping, interrupts her and just says, "Lying." And then she like hugs the cat. And it's like this really tender moment. But I would suggest anybody that enjoys Farscape, check that out. It's an incredible book that touches on a lot of the same themes, and does a lot of cool stuff. But as far as my own stuff, you can find me at Twitter, twitter.com. Is that how it still works? I don't know what that person did with Twitter.
I'll just let you go.
Yeah, twitter.com/Oddnon1, because I had an old account called Oddnon that got taken by somebody else. I'm also on Blue Sky, just Oddnon at .blue sky, whatever. And I'll provide my link tree to
I'll put it in the doobly-doo.
Sara and Josh. And that'll be the best way to find me. I'm pretty much everywhere. And then I'm twitch.tv/Oddnon. I don't have like a totally set schedule, but I typically stream 3 or 4 times a week, 4 or 5 hours a piece. And that's where you'll find me. So
Very nice. I'm Josh Gosdin. I'm over on Instagram at Josh Gosdin. And it's nothing but food and self-care by and large. Those are two of my favorite things.
They're important things.
They are. What about you, Sarah? Where can we find you?
I'm on YouTube at the Fat Culture Critic. I'm also on Twitter, Bluestockin Sara, and I'm on Blue Sky. Sara Ezzat at Blue Sky stuff. Yeah, whatever. It's in the doobly-doo, and it's on the screen. So, and of course we have our Patreon, and we have our Discord stuff in there as well. And I'm actually I forgot that I was going to read you some comments.
Oh, yay.
On Twitter, about the different destinations. We replied from Yum Yum Pod, who apparently have a podcast about sci-fi stuff. So people should check that out.
Yum Yum Pod, how you doing?
And it's such a shame that they didn't bring this writer back. I really enjoyed this episode, and it's some of the best and saddest material of the series.
Yes.
Probably my favorite Harvey scene in the show.
Yeah.
A big plus had for Jewel, since she loudly called out Peacekeeper nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had a little exchange about Jewel being a big mess and loving her anyway, or loving her as a mess. And then we also on Twitter from A Patton brackets Mouse. Really loved the way y'all related this to current events in Gaza. It was an angle I wasn't expecting, but I deeply appreciate.
Glad you got that.
And then we got a couple of comments on the channel. From Molly Mockery. Thank you for sharing your experiences with all of us and for having this important and difficult discussion. And may violence end and peace be achieved for all those currently suffering the horrors of war.
Thanks for listening. That's what we're here for.
For self-inflicted wounds, we got the comment from Mainly Mandy. Shout out. We love Mainly Mandy.
Hey, Mandy.
This two-parter always devastated me, especially Stark trying to get to Zahn.
Oh, God.
I gotta watch it now.
You and me both, Mandy.
And finally, another from Molly Mockery, from Sons and Lovers. I agree that this episode makes you work for a bit more than most, but I still enjoy it. As silly as the plot may be, it barely registers on the Farscape scale. And of course, you like the plot.
I did.
As for the John and Aaron conversation, I had attributed John's change of heart to seeing Aaron drop through the floor right in front of him. She just came back to life, and suddenly she's potentially falling to her death again. I can't blame him for deciding that their lives are too short, so they might as well bang it out while they can.
That is that is a valid catch that I think we all missed in that discussion.
Yeah. I like you and Molly obviously had felt that there were enough reasons for that change of heart, whereas I was wanting something in the text, but
sure,
can't have everything. So yeah,
you can't have your Cav Rock and eat it too.
So yeah, thank you for those comments, folks. And I also want to shout out Ren the Barbarian for
love Ren.
Yeah, I mean shouting them out anyway because we love Ren, but also they edited the Conflicted Wounds episode, which allowed me to focus on editing different destinations. So I really appreciate them for that.
Check out Ren the Barbarian's YouTube channel.
Yes, they have a great video about the Joker and sort of sympathizing for characters like that, which is, I think, maybe add something to the discussion that we had about the whole like mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
sadism stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would suggest checking that out. So thank you everyone for being here. We will see you in 2 weeks for Thanks for Sharing. Thank you very much, Oddnon, for joining us. You were great.
Absolutely.
And we love
Thank you.
all of your input, and we are going to have you back.
Awesome.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Double your pleasure, double your fun.
Equal and original.